Hi, and welcome to a lecture on anatomy, where we're going to talk about the bones of the human body and some of the terminology that we use to describe those bones. By the end of this lecture, you should have a good idea of what forensic anthropologists do in order to identify victims of crimes or accidents. So let's go on. The field of forensic anthropology is that branch of physical anthropology that analyzes human skeletal remains, usually during some kind of crime investigation or following a natural disaster. So we help identify victims of genocides, war crimes, natural disasters, and of course crimes. You've all seen TV shows like CSI or Bones, where they solve murder mysteries, and that's part of the job, but a larger part is the preceding three items I mentioned, as well as research and teaching. Forensic anthropologists, when they start an investigation, follow a very strict set of procedures in a specific order, which helps them determine the age, sex, and height of a victim. First of all, to determine the age of a victim, a forensic anthropologist always use a range from, say, for example, age 12 to 15, because there's a lot of variation in people and we all age a little differently. So we want to make sure we don't rule out anyone by narrowing it too specifically. Most of the most accurate estimations come from our teeth. Remember those baby teeth that you put under your pillow? Well, they all, it turns out, come out at the same time. So we can look at what's in the mouth and what teeth baby teeth have been lost, what permanent teeth have come in, and determine the age from that. But also we have two other areas we can look at. One is the epiphyses, or growth plates, and the other is the cranial sutures. So we'll look at each of those independently. Okay, first the cranial sutures. When you are born, your brain is not but your skull is not one solid piece yet. And in fact, it doesn't become a solid piece until age 50. And that can vary by individuals. It also can vary by sex a little bit. So if you look at the top, the sagittal suture is the one that's the red arrow shows. That one is open until about the age of 29. By the time you hit age 35, it's completely closed. Take a look there. There's two other sutures that are noted. The lambdoidal is toward the back of the skull, and the coronal is toward the front end of the skull. So when a forensic anthropologist looks at a skull where the sagittal suture is completely fused, we know that they are a particular age. Then if you flip the skull upside down, and we're looking at the bottom side of the skull now, we have the basilar suture, and that's circled with in black there. If it is open, then we know that the individual is 18 years or younger. So that is completely fused by age 19 for most people. Then we have the growth plates, also called the epiphysis. At birth, when you're born, you have approximately 450 bones. But by the time you are an adult, that has shrunk to 206 bones. So where do all the bones go? Well, they fuse together. If you look at the diagram on the right, you can see the bones of the arm. There is a label there, the diaphysis, which is basically the long bone, in this case of the arm. And up above that, you'll see the epiphysis, which is the growth plate. Those two bones, the epiphysis and the diaphysis, they fuse as you grow, and they fuse at certain ages. Um, so we can tell from based on what growth plates have fused into the long bone, we can tell what your age is. The last of the growth plates fuses around age 28, but you have several growth plates all over your body. Okay, now let's take a look at terminology. We use certain terms to describe the body. It makes it easier to identify. Now, you'll need this as we go forward in the semester, and we are going to be looking at certain fossils that have been found that are of the human species or in the lineage of the human species. So you want to know these terms. The term anatomical position refers to the view of the body as you see the image in front of you, where the palms are up so that the ulna, which is one of the bones in the arm, is on the inside and the radius is on the outside. If you don't know what the radius and ulna is, here's a skeleton, and you can see the radius is the thicker bone on the outside of the lower arm, and the ulna is on the inside. So we call this position, with the palms forward, anatomical position. Now, the line that runs from the top of the head through the nose to the feet is referred to as the midline. So here's a picture of the midline. Now, as you move away from the midline, we call that the moving laterally. And the bones that are closer to the midline are referred to as medial. So medial is closer to the middle, lateral is farther from the middle. And then there is the front and back line, which runs from the top of the head through the ear. So now we're on the side of the body to the feet. And here's a picture of the front back line. You can see it shows exactly as I said, the side of the body. Okay, so when we are looking at the front of the body, we call that the anterior. Anything toward the front is the anterior. Anything toward the back is the posterior. The terms dorsal and ventral are also used, but anterior and posterior are used most frequently. Now, when we talk about bones in relationship to each other, like this bone is more lateral than that bone, we use terms like superior, which means closer to the top of the head, inferior, which is closer to the top of the feet, bottom of the feet. And then other positional terms are proximal, which means closer to your body. So, for example, the bone that comprises the top of your arm is called the humerus. That is more proximal than your fingers are, since it is closer to the trunk of the body. If it's farther from the body, we refer to that as distal. So your fingers are more distal than your humerus is, because it's further. And we use these terms to describe the ends of the bones, especially the arms and legs. Okay, now let's take a look at the skeleton and how we name the parts of the skeleton, and then we'll talk about the bones too. So when you hear the term appendicular skeleton, you know you're talking about all the bones of the arms and the legs, and that includes the pelvis, the hip bones, and the clavicle, which is what the shoulder is comprised of. Then the term axial skeleton is all the bones along the midline. So along the midline, we have the head, the cranium, the mandible, which is makes up your chin, the rib cage and all the ribs, and the spinal column. And the picture on the right shows in blue all the bones of the axial skeleton. Here's another image of the axial skeleton. So you see on the right, on the left is a full skeleton, and the blue parts are the axial skeleton. And it picks apart each of the individual sections, like the vertebral column, the skull, and the rib cage. Okay, let's take a look at all the bones of the body. Talk about those all each individually. Your sternum is your breastplate, and it's actually made up of 3 bones. You can see it here marked in red. The manubrium is the one at the top in the green. Below that is the sternal body in blue, and below that's the xiphoid process in purple. Now, if you were to touch your breastplate toward the bottom, and you can find the xiphoid process, it's right where you begin to feel a little indentation. And if you do that right now, you can feel it pretty easily. So that's where your xiphoid process is. In the ribs, there are 12 ribs. Each one connects to the spinal column in the back individually to a vertebrae. Here's a picture of, on the left is the front, on the right is the back, so you can see each of the vertebrae connected to a rib. And if you need a tattoo, here's some of the inspiration for you. Okay, here's a picture of an individual vertebrae, and they are stacked in your vertebral column. They're irregularly shaped, and they make up most of the vertebral column. There's a couple other sections that we'll talk about too. So the vertebral column is just a stack of bones, and we often call that your backbone. It's made up of 24 vertebrae plus the sacrum and the coccyx. So here's a picture of the vertebrae, and you can see it's divided into 3 sections: the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, and the lumbar vertebrae. And at the bottom, you can see the sacrum and the coccyx, and these are typically called your tailbone. Okay, here's the cervical vertebrae. It connects to the spine to the skull, and take a look at where that is joining. The red bones are the cervical vertebrae, and they join at the bottom of the skull. So your spinal column goes up into the skull from there. Your thoracic vertebrae are just below that, and those, like I said earlier, connect to the ribs. So there's 12, 1 for each rib. And then we have the lumbar vertebrae. There's 5 of those, and they're marked in red on the diagram. And below that are the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum is 5 fused vertebrae, so they are counted as a single vertebrae. Okay, here's the shoulders. Let's take a look. The large picture is looking at your back. So on the back, the big blades are called the scapula, and in the front, moving around toward the front of the shoulder area, is the clavicle. Your arms, the clavicle and the arms connect at a joint. The top of the arm is referred to as the humerus. The lower part of your arm is made up of 2 long bones, referred to the radius and the ulna, which you can see in the diagram. And then you have the wrist and the hand. Here's a picture of the parts of the hand. There's 3 parts to a finger. You have the proximal end, the distal end, and the medial end of the fingers. And do you remember how those terms were used? The bones in the hand, at the wrist, you have the carpals. Then below that, where your palm is, are the metacarpals. And your fingers are called phalanges. Your pelvis has 2 halves. The pelvis is your hip bone, and it's made up of 3 parts. the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The ilium are the big blades that you'll see. The ischium is where you sit. And the pubis, when we look at a picture, you'll see it wraps around to the front. So here you can see each of the innominates. Those are the two sides, left and right. And then the ilium is the big blade. There's the pubis showing, which is marked in green, and the ischium. This is also called the pelvic girdle. Okay, using the pelvis is one of the best ways we can tell the difference between males and females. For a male, you'll see at the base of the pelvic bone, there's the pubic arch, and it's marked on the diagram. The pubic arch is narrower for a male. For a female, it's broader and wider, has a larger angle. Also, if you look at the pelvic brim, females have a larger brim, and that's for obvious reasons, because we women give birth to big-brained babies. Also, the shape of the blades is slightly different on a male and a female. Okay, moving on down the leg, we have the femur, which is the bone that makes up your thigh. And it's one of the longer bones in your body. Below that is the kneecap, and that's referred to as the patella. Your lower leg is made up of two bones, the tibia and the fibula, and you can see them marked on the diagram. The tibia is on the inside, the medial bone, and the lateral bone is the fibula on the outside. Below that, you can see the feet, and we'll look at those individually. So here's the feet. They are made up of much the same bones as the hands, only instead of referring to the metacarpals, which are your palm, we refer to that section as the metatarsals. So the tarsals make up your ankle, the metatarsals make up the long bones in your foot, and your toes are phalanges, just like your fingers are called phalanges. Okay, let's look at the skull, and we're almost done. Here is the frontal bone. There's a number of bones that make up the skull, and remember, once you're past a certain age, all these bones are fused. But when you're a baby, they're not fused. You've heard of the soft spot at the top of a baby's head. Well, that's because the bones in the skull aren't fused yet. Okay, so here's the frontal bone. You can see it's the area marked in green on the picture. It joins with the parietal bone at the coronal suture. So the parietal bone is on the side of your head, and we'll see in a second how this all maps together. The coronal suture is the suture at the front, the closest to the front of your skull. So here's another picture of the parietal bone. You have two, one on each side. Remember, it connects to the frontal bone. And it joins at the sagittal suture. The parietal bones, the two join at the sagittal suture, which is the suture on the top of your head shown in this picture. And then they join to the occipital bone at the lambdoid suture. So that's the one on the other side toward the back of the skull. Here's the occipital bone, is the one that joins up with the parietal bones. You can see it at the back of the skull here, circling in front of you. Sometimes we call that the occiput. And again, like I said, it joins at the lambdoid suture to the parietal bones, and it forms a part of the foramen magnum. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, but it's really important in human history. So here's a picture of the foramen magnum. Now, we're looking at the bottom of the skull, And what foramen magnum, it's a Latin word, and all it means is big hole. This is where your spinal cord enters the skull. And why that's so important in anthropology or paleoanthropology is human beings walk upright. And in order to walk upright, your spinal column has to connect to the skull at the foramen magnum, right in the center of the skull. So you see this, the foramen magnum here is pretty centrally located. If you were to look at a dog, because they walk on all fours, in order to hold their head up to see, the foramen magnum would be closer to the back of the skull. So as humans evolved and began to walk, we see that the very earliest species in the human lineage, the foramen magnum is a little further, closer to the back of the skull than it is in our species. And it gradually moved to the front, so we knew that they were beginning to walk upright. Okay, the temporal bone is on the side. It forms part of the ear canal. We call the ear canal the auditory meatus. A mandible makes up your chin, your jawbone, basically. And it consists of two parts that are fused, the body of it, and the other part is called the ramus, and that's that part, the vertical part that moves up towards your skull. The area where it's fused is called the symphysis. The maxilla, it's pictured in green here. It's also two parts fused into one. The zygomatic is your cheekbone, and it's marked in green here. It's the arch at the top of your cheekbone. The sphenoid bone extends all the way through from right to left if you were looking down on the skull. Here we can see it. If we were looking down on the skull, there's the sphenoid bone, and it's shaped like a butterfly, as you can see. It's also called a Turkish saddle. In fact, that's what the sphenoid means in Latin. Okay, so here we have all the bones together. You can see how they're knit. And I want you to pay attention here to the mastoid process. Now, this is another bone that we can use to distinguish males from females. It's bigger and projects more in males than in females. Also on males, you'll tend to see that there's ridges over the eyes called brow ridges, and they tend to be larger in males as well. So mastoid is part of the temporal bone, and again, like I said, it can be used to distinguish male and female. And we call it a process, and all that means is it's a part of the bone that sticks out. Okay, so here's a picture of all the sutures, and they're all named. I won't repeat them. The primary ones that we look at are the coronal, sagittal, and lambdoid, which I've misspelled here. And those are used extensively to age. You can see the picture on the left where they are not fused, and then the picture on the right shows them having been fused. So that's it for the lecture today. What should you know? Well, I've gone into a lot of detail. Some of the information I don't require that you know, but if you take a look at the appendix of your textbook and look on page A4, which shows a full skeleton, and at page A8, which shows a skull, those pages list the bones you should know, and the sutures you should know. Okay, now when you go on to there's an exercise in here that's going to ask you to find it's going to give you some clues, and then you got to find the age and the sex of a skeleton. So that will have a little more information about the growth plates and at what ages those begin to fuse, as well as a little more information on the sutures and what to look for. So when you get to the apply section, click on the link there, and hopefully you have enough to get you going. Okay, good luck.